Is Random Thoughts again, and in this video I'm going to talk about the slave trade in East Africa and how cruel and brutal it was, and some details that we get from documents that we don't usually read, that are kind of what is the word? They make you feel personally, it makes me feel very sad. And if you've been watching, you know that I've been reading the diary of one Richard Meinertzhagen, the guy who is often said to have shot Koitalel Arab Samoe. And this is a diary that talk or covers his stay in Kenya from 1902 to 1906. And the diary was published in 1957 as a book. Now, in the diary, of course, he makes many entries, and most of these entries are not really interesting. It's normal stuff anybody would write about their day-to-day routine. But then there are entries that stand out, of course, and they have a lot of historical significance. In this diary, he does talk about slavery in East Africa. And in particular, there are several entries about this topic. The first entry he mentions about slave trade is when he talks about him going to Zanzibar with somebody else. He goes to Zanzibar and he meets a guy who went by the name Tippu Tip. Now, Tippu Tip was an Arab slave trader. And this is a name, if you've studied Kenyan history, the name used to be in history textbooks that we used to read in primary school. So it wasn't a new name to me. But what was new, of course, is to have somebody write in their diary that they went to Zanzibar in around 1902, late 1902, and they met this guy. This guy was one of the biggest slave traders of the 19th century. And Meinertzhagen meets him in Zanzibar, and they go meet him with somebody, his host in Zanzibar. And when they go to his house, Tippu Tip doesn't want to talk about his career as a slave trader. And the host of Richard Meinertzhagen, another British guy, tells him this guy doesn't like talking about that. So he doesn't really get anything from him about slave trading in East Africa. But then it so happens that later on, around 1904, Richard Meinertzhagen makes other entries, and these entries mention this guy, but more specifically, they mention a guy by the name Old Mbarak. Now, Mbarak used to work for Tippu Tip, and he also used to work for another guy who went by the name Emin Pasha. Now, Emin Pasha seems like was another slave trader. And Mbarak, turns out at that time now, around 1904, he works for Richard Meinertzhagen. And at this time, Richard Meinertzhagen has moved from central Kenya and is in Nandi, we can say North Rift now. And he's there to, of course, take care of the situations there with the Nandi people who are, of course, not very happy with the Europeans coming and trying to become their overlords. And so Richard Meinertzhagen had been sent there to control the situation. And it's while he's there that he talks about this Mbarak guy who works for him. And this Mbarak guy used to work for Tippu Tip, and he used to work for Emin Pasha. And he talks about one day them taking a trip to Kitale. Kitale. And he wanted to go to Kitale for several reasons, but one of the reasons was he wanted to see Kitale because Kitale was a renowned slave trade market. I didn't know about Kitale. Of course, today Kitale is a big town. It is headquarters of the Trans Nzoia County. It is we call it the surrounding land is called it produces a lot of maize for the most part, and I think wheat to some extent. So that's what we know Kitale for today. But then, yeah, in early 1900s, Kitale was known for being a slave market, and Meinertzhagen wanted to go there for that reason, to see this place where slaves were brought and kept. And the things that happened there that he describes are very horrible things. Now, I'm going to talk some more about the actual things that happened in Kitale, but I need to talk about something else first. And that is that when you read those entries, or when I was reading those entries, something became very clear to me, that um, there were people in East Africa who were captured to become slaves, and they used to come from specific tribes, not all tribes. And it usually was the weaker tribes. And weaker here, I don't mean that they were inherently weak, but often it was after two tribes fight, one is conquered, then the conquered tribe would easily be sold into slavery by the conquering tribe. Because the reason I'm saying that, Meinertzhagen makes an entry that says, or he says that Mbarak told him they used to come to that side of the country, Kitale, with Tippu Tip and Emin Pasha and other traders. And usually when they came to that part, they usually avoided the Maasai. They didn't want to come into contact with the Maasai, because the Maasai were very, very protective of their people. Of course, they will fight anybody who tried to intrude into their land. So he said whenever they came to Kitale, coming to Kitale and leaving from Kitale with slaves, they used to avoid the Maasai. So that told me there's no way they used to capture the Maasai to become slaves. And it doesn't seem that these slaves were usually the Nandi. These slaves seems to have come from elsewhere, or maybe the Ndorobo or the smaller tribes that existed within the larger tribes. So I remembered what Ludwig Kraft writes in his book about the Kwavi people. And in that book, it describes to us, or it tells us about the story of one Kwafi young man who was captured by slave traders. And it occurred to me at that moment, as I was reading the diary by Richard Meinertzhagen, what happened, what Ludwig Kraft describes made a lot of sense to me, because Ludwig Kraft tells us about this boy, or this young man who went by the name Lemasegnot. Now, Lemasegnot came from the family of Nkobore, and they were Kwafi people. And this young man was captured immediately after the Kwafi had been crushed by the Maasai, and they were in fact moving from Kenya all the way to Tanzania, and that's when he was captured. And it's also a very sad story, because Ludwig Kraft tells us that this young man was captured while he was playing with other boys. And after he was captured, the mom was told that your boy has been captured by some strangers. And the mom, being a mom, of course, she decides to run after this group of people who had taken her son. And what happens, of course, they captured her as well, and they take both the son and mom to the coast, and the mom is taken to Zanzibar, and the boy is taken to Mombasa. So yeah, so they were captured after the Kwafi had basically lost their power. But coming back to this diary, Richard Meinertzhagen tells us that these traders used to avoid the Maasai. They didn't want to come into contact with them. Now, what happened in Kitale? Richard Meinertzhagen tells us that Mbarak told him what happened in Kitale. And in fact, he went with Mbarak to Kitale. And Richard Meinertzhagen tells us that when they arrived there, that's around 1904, the structures where the slaves used to be held was still standing. Some of them had been burned down, but you could still see the structure. They were still there. Basically, you could see the remnants of that activity. And he tells us that Mbarak told him that once the men were captured, like that, Mbarak told him that they used to buy or capture both men and women, mostly young men and young women. They preferred young men and young women, which of course makes sense why they will prefer young men and young women. Most likely they will fetch a better price for those ones than taking old men and old women. And he says that once these people were brought to Kitale, the men were castrated immediately, and they were always in shackles. They were never, there's no time that they were allowed to be free. So from that moment, they were in shackles, and they are castrated immediately. And Barak told him that Meinertzhagen was wondering whether there was any kind of treatment that would be given after that procedure, and there was nothing really that was used to be given. They just castrate these these men, and then some of them will die out of that. And in fact, Mubarak told him that close to 50% of the men died. Most of them died, of course, from infection after the procedure, and others died through fatigue, especially when they were traveling to the coast. And he said any man who became too tired to continue the trek, they just shot them. They didn't leave them free or anything, they just shot them. So he says close to 50% of the slaves that were captured and brought to Kitale will not reach Mombasa or will not reach the coast, Bagamoyo, because that was mostly where they went to. They will not reach the coast, anyways. They will perish before they reach the coast. And he also told him that the young women, did have their own terrible treatment, and he talks of them being assaulted, and I can't use the word because these platforms wouldn't allow those words to be used, but you get assaulted sexually, that is. And he told him that this used to happen every time they will stop somewhere. These girls will be used by the traders, and then the next stop, the same thing would happen until they reach the coast. And then he also said, now, it's not even the story itself that is sad, but it's the way Mbarak tells it that is also makes it even more terrible. And that is because Richard Meinertzhagen asks him, why did he join that, become part of that? And he said it was a good job. Like, there was a lot of food, and there was also a lot of girls to use at whatever time you want. Like, he mentions those two things. He didn't even mention that it was about money, really. It was about the food and the free girls he will get, of course, by force. Now, that was a brutal, inhumane form of economic activity. Of course, slavery has always been, there is no slavery that is not terrible. It's always terrible. Now, but there is also a question that many people, I guess, would ask, the way I would ask, where did most of these slaves go to? Most of them, of course, were going to the Arab world. Now, on the other side of the continent, of course, transatlantic slave trade was going on, and this was more of European affair, while to the East Africa, it was more of Arab affair. Now, the European slave trade resulted in the huge population, of course, of Black people in North America and South America to a large extent. And now we might wonder, do we have the same population in the Arab world that is Black, that was taken from Africa as slaves? Um, the answer is yes or no. And I think the environment was different, but these entries by Meinertzhagen do explain some part of that. The fact that young men were captured and were immediately castrated after being captured in Kitale, and then they are taken as people who would never reproduce, says a lot. That these people, when they reached the Arab world, of course, they could not reproduce, and I think they were not even allowed to mix with the women. So even if they were not castrated, there was not going to be any chance of that happening, unlike in the US, where that was allowed. And to some extent, the Europeans kind of had a different strategy of reproducing them in the new land. The Arabs seems like they didn't have that strategy of taking them from here and going to reproduce them wherever they take them, so that they don't have to come back to the continent to pick new ones. Seems like the Arabs didn't have that strategy. And I think for the Arabs, there was also the aspect of conversions. For those slaves who converted to Islam, most likely they were let go, and then they were embraced as just part of the community, and they were not kind of separated that much. But of course, there must have been discrimination that went on. And today we have small populations of Black people in Saudi Arabia, for example, small groups of Black people in Iraq, small populations of Black people in Iran, small populations of Black people in Turkey and those countries. Those people must have come from that trade, the East Africa slave trade. And those ones are what survived. They are not huge populations, and often most people don't even talk about them. Most people don't even know they exist, but they are there. Yeah, so those are what Meinertzhagen says in some entries in his diary about the slave trade in East Africa. Those are my random thoughts.